everybody, and welcome. Thank you for joining our discussion this afternoon on community collaboration in journalism. My name is Rachel Artakis, and I'm the state editor here at the Illinois Answers Project, and I'm very excited to be kicking off our event this evening, Beyond the Byline program, with our panelists and our moderators who will be discussing about the importance of community collaboration with journalism and the communities we cover. Our panel this afternoon is moderated by Illinois Answer reporters Alex Nitkin, who covers government accountability and finance for us, as well as Grace Hauck, who is an embedded investigative reporter on our state team. They'll be discussing, chatting with our panelists for the next hour or so, and I'm honored to introduce them to you. First, we have Tonika Lewis-Johnson. She is a social justice artist and photographer. She's also the creator of the Folded Map Project. It's a visual investigation examining Chicago's communities, segregation, and the impact on its residents. Some of her latest work is called Inequity for Sale, which examines the history of homes sold under the discriminatory land sale contracts in Greater Englewood during the 1950s and 60s. Next, we have Jamie Kalven. He is a writer and founder of the Invisible Institute, which just this week was a recipient of 2 Pulitzer Prizes. He has reported extensively on police abuse and impunity, including reporting that brought to light the police shooting of 17-year-old Laquan McDonald, and he co-produced 16 Shots, the Emmy Award-winning documentary about the case. Next, we have Mauricio Peña, who is the editorial director at Borderless magazine, where he leads the nonprofit's coverage of immigration and immigrants. Mauricio began his career as a reporter for DNA Info, Chicago. Can you hear me? Okay. He's a founding member of Block Club Chicago, where he was a Southwest Side reporter. He also reported for Desert Sun, part of the USA Today network, as well as Chalk Beat Chicago. And lastly, we have Shamus Toomey, who is the publisher and one of 3 co-founders of Block Club Chicago. The independent nonprofit newsroom launched in 2018 with 8 staffers and now has 36 staff members and a growing group of freelancers. Previously, he was a managing editor at DNA Info Chicago, and he was a metro editor at the Chicago Sun-Times. Before we get started, if you have any questions, I encourage you to think of them and save them for the end. Our moderators will be doing an audience Q&A after the panel. And with that, I'll hand it over to Grace. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Rachel. Let's get right into it. All of you here do work or are part of organizations that aim to fill gaps in the journalism landscape in some way. Would you be able to talk about how your organization or your particular practice came to be and what role community plays in that?
Well, since I guess I'll kick it off. I'm not going to say I'm the oddball of the bunch, but I exist between being an artist, photographer, and investigative journalist. My project Folded Map that you all heard briefly described is a visual investigation. It's multimedia, and it was presented to the public as an art project. But it included Chicago's large-scale map, video interviews of people who live on the same street in Chicago, but in racially and economically different neighborhoods 15 miles apart. So that is a little bit more than an art project. It definitely involved a lot of investigation and interviewing. And for me, I would say as a trained journalist, because my background, I am an alumni of Columbia College, and I majored in print journalism, and my goal was to become a staffed photojournalist. But in the early 2000s, it was very clear to me that my neighborhood that I still live in, Greater Englewood, was bullied in the media, as well as a lot of the South and West Side neighborhoods. And I knew that at some point I was going to have to return to my home neighborhood, photographing and covering stories that just didn't speak to how I wanted my neighborhood to be portrayed. And so I really was trying to find an avenue to push the limits of how photography can make this investigative approach and access to large systemic issues more available to the public. And so that led me to eventually do my folded map project. But as I said, the project included a lot of individuals who I refer to as map twins that met each other, that lived in different neighborhoods. So without them and their involvement, my project would not exist, as well as all of my other projects. But community is very important in what I call participatory and reparative art that is rooted in investigation and historical matters, but also using the actual individuals that all of this data is about to be involved in an artistic way to share their voice.
So I have, in a curious way, a parallel story. I'm a native South Sider, and more a writer than a journalist by profession. Starting in the early 90s, having grown up in the Kenwood area of the city, I began to work sort of parallel to my writing career. I was finishing a book on a whole set of initiatives around the South Side. And really at the heart of the work, looking back on it, was an exploration of what it might mean to be a neighbor under conditions of urban apartheid. If you took the role of neighbor seriously and fully inhabited it, what would that look like? And we actually all know how to be neighbors. I mean, there's a sort of common currency of neighborliness, right? I need a tool. Hey, can I borrow, I need some flour. There's something I need a little extra muscle to do. Can you come help me move this? And so the idea was to, in a whole range of initiatives around the South Side, was to use the medium of physical work, cleaning up vacant lots, boarding up abandoned buildings, to build relationships, but also to sort of expand boundaries. And my boundaries kept expanding, and I ended up deeply involved for a period of close to 15 years in the high-rise public housing on South State Street, Stateway Gardens particularly, in sort of the last chapter of high-rise public housing in Chicago, which has now all been demolished. But in those years, it was an utterly abandoned set of neighboring communities that represented, as of the early 90s, the biggest concentration of public housing and the biggest concentration of poverty in the country. Stateway Gardens, where I worked, some academic had sort of figured out on the basis of the 1990 census that Stateway was the poorest single neighborhood in the country based on census tracts. And so I found myself in this, fascinating, rich, complex community, as unfathomable as any human community, and was working on all sorts of practical projects. We created something called the Neighborhood Conservation Corps that created employment alternatives for young men in the street organizations and the gangs and coming out of prison. And I also worked closely with the resident leadership in the development. And for a time, while doing this work, I had lots of relationships in media in Chicago as sort of a mid-career writer. And I worked as a kind of fixer, helping other journalists do stories in that setting. Ultimately, was so frustrated with the quality of coverage. I think of it now as a kind of folklore that we generate through media about our neighbors, that we started to do our own reporting and our own documentation from Stateway Gardens. a publication online called The View from the Ground, and really trying to center the experience of people in the development. And I can say more about how the Invisible Institute sort of evolved out of that practice. But I think, to Tonika's point, the critical point is when I started to report from Stateway Gardens, I had extraordinary sources because I'd been there for 4 or 5 years working with people side by side. So they weren't really sources. They were friends, colleagues, neighbors, and that foundation of deep, immersive relationships on the South Side has really been foundational to all of the reporting that I and my colleagues have done since. And, so I think if there's a common theme for us, I won't speak for others, but certainly, it's that, that need to invest in building the relationships in order to do the kind of reporting we aspire to do and to have the kind of conversations we aspire to have.
Borderless started as a rapid response project back in 2017 in response to the Trump Muslim travel ban. And it was only intended to be a short-term project, but there was a need for, more reporting that centered the voices of immigrant communities, especially as diverse as the immigrant communities in Chicago are, and rebranded nearly 5 years ago as Borderless magazine to cover pretty much anything and everything in Chicago through the lens of immigration, so labor, environmental justice, housing. And I've been on the team since the fall, and I've seen a great need, especially we publish all of our reporting in English and Spanish, and a lot of people are coming to the Spanish language content, our resource guides and things like that. And even a couple last fall when I started and I was pushing a lot of investigations for our team, we were seeing a lot of the migrants at the migrant shelters asking us questions on WhatsApp, calling our numbers just to get more information that just wasn't there. And so a lot of our reporting are not just on these topics that touch their lives, but resource guides that fill gaps that they're not getting elsewhere. And so for us, it's just making sure that communities, the most vulnerable communities in Chicago, are getting that information readily in the language that they speak. And so all of our, as I mentioned, all of our stories are in English and Spanish, but some of our stories also get translated in other languages. We've published some of our stories for Afghan refugees in Dari in Persian, so that they can read, and we get people from Afghanistan reading as well. And so just want to make sure that people, especially in Chicago, are getting this information, or that they're not getting it elsewhere from other publications.
Block Club Chicago, it really started out of necessity. We needed jobs. We were all laid off. Alex was there. Sorry. But we closed one night in 2017, and that was it. And a couple of us just sat around and feeling sorry for ourselves. And then something really strange happened. We started to hear from a bunch of readers, social, email, text, and they just said, hey, we still need this sort of neighborhood news that DNA Info used to do. We really grew to rely on it over the 5 years you did it. So, if you were to come back, we would support you. You never asked the readers to support. It was all one funder, and when he was tired of doing it, he walked away. So it was sort of a light bulb moment where we said, well, we love doing this. We think it's very important to Chicago to cover the small, medium, and large stories in Chicago's neighborhoods, the stories that really had gotten left behind by the legacy media that had been cutting back their newsrooms for forever. And there were so many stories out there. It was leading to just a lot of just the negative stories of Chicago were being told. You know, if a TV news crew has one crew to send out somewhere, they're probably going to send it out to the shooting that happened an hour ago, and there's 8 news crews there. So we were trying to cover different stories, better stories, stories that we felt really reflected Chicago. So we decided, okay, let's figure out a way to do this, a reader-supported newsroom that would be a nonprofit that would ask readers to support us, and we'd go out there and we'd do the same kind of work. We started off small. As Grace said, we started off with 8 people total. And we've been able to, we made the promise to readers, if you continue to support us and we can afford another reporter, we'll hire another reporter. And so gradually we've been adding more and more people, trying to put a reporter in every neighborhood of Chicago. We've got a ways to go, but one reporter now typically covers about 3 neighborhoods, maybe about 100,000 people. We try to group neighborhoods together. That makes some sense. They share some things together. And then we just have them report everything that moves that is of interest to them and of interest to the people that live around them. And so that's really what it was. Chicago, we felt, needed those neighborhood stories that sometimes don't really mean anything to people on the other side of town, but to the people that live in that neighborhood, they're hugely important. And so, you know, we think that can, you know, really become almost like a neighborhood newspaper for that part of town, or a little small town paper for that part of town. So that's how we got started.
Good? Okay, there I am. Thank you all so much for that. One theme that I feel like I heard from all 4 of you, it's the idea of service. Of, you know, we at Ellen Rances in our newsroom, I feel like we talk about the idea or the contrast between what does it mean to report about communities as opposed to reporting about people as opposed to reporting for people. And it sounds like that's something that really all of your organizations were built on. This is definitely something that in my first real journalism job at DNA Info, Shamus was the first person who ever hired me. Thank you for that. I feel like I learned a ton about. I was covering like Jefferson Park and, you know, the far northwest side of the city in a place I'd never really known about before. But this idea of like sort of overlapping your sources with your audience, with even your colleagues in a sense, right? That you're sort of blurring these like traditional journalistic lines of like detachment. So I wonder if anyone who wants can just talk about the idea of like what work looks like that really draws people to become sources, to want to engage with your work, to want to think like, oh, I recognize myself in this and I want to be a part of your next story.
I think something that I learned at DNA Info and probably got even better at Block Club Chicago, and I, you know, practice at Borderless magazine, is just fostering those relationships with community members and be willing to take feedback, because the stories ultimately are a service for that community. I have people that I've met from when I first moved to Chicago over 10 years ago who still reach out to me. And I think with story tips, with story ideas, with things that aren't being reported, and I think that comes down to cultivating a relationship with people and not treating them as transactional. Just here, I need a quote for this or that. I think it's fostering those relationships that really allows for community to be built, and for them to be seen in the journalism that's being produced. I think it's something over the last 10 years that I really have gravitated to, and I learned that at DNA Info and Blog Club. And I think it's just a matter of really fostering those relationships and having honest, genuine relationships and conversations with people in those communities, because ultimately it's a public service, and I think it's not about us as journalists, it's about the people that you are reporting with for these stories.
Yeah, I would expand on that and say that the service is certainly one way of describing a certain style of reporting, but I would also use the word accountability. You know, it's a relationship to the folks you're reporting on that sort of allows them to say, boy, did you get that wrong? Boy, you know, I mean, that kind of that kind of feedback and that kind of availability. And, you know, for me, at the beginnings of the style of reporting we do in the Invisible Institute, the medium was really the street, you know, it was the street. That's where stories came to you, that's where news was shared, and that's where, you know, people told you were full of it if you got it wrong. So I think that notion of accountability is really critical in this kind of reporting. I think the other thing that, you know, we've all touched on in a way, and we try to be quite intentional about this at the Invisible Institute, is the reporting itself is also an investigatory tool in the sense that you create feedback loops where you get tips, critical feedback, other information as you're putting out information. And that relationship to, you know, what I hesitate to call an audience, because what you're really trying to engage is almost, you know, co-investigation with the community. And when that takes hold, it's really powerful. You know, it's really powerful. And I just, you know, a final thought on that, and again, we, you know, particularly in the afterglow of things like the Pulitzers, we try to come back and the team I'm part of, to recognize all the ways in which we're failing. And the things we haven't done, we haven't completed, the places we haven't gotten. And, you know, one of the fundamental things that I think has been true for us, and I imagine for some others, is as we've accessed bigger and bigger audiences, you know, on major platforms, there's the question of whether we are effectively really reaching the street. And I think it's just important to keep that question in front of us, as the degree, you know, and all of us aspire to have our work read and valued by the folks we report on. But it's not a foregone conclusion that that happens given the structure of media.
Yeah, so for my work, as I said, I call it participatory art, and trust me, it's very participatory. As I said, a lot of my work is rooted in my home neighborhood, Greater Englewood, and I still live there. So even if I didn't want it to be participatory, my neighbors, my people I grew up with, they're gonna make it participatory because I am not only reporting for them, doing projects for them, but also advocating for them. And as a result of the trajectory of my artistic practice growing, they hold me accountable, and they also are willing to share their deeply rooted, valuable knowledge about how these systemic issues impact them and their lives. And so it's always a conversation, and I'll just give one example of how this like co-creation and being very biased, which is why I knew I couldn't be a journalist, because I am very biased, have very strong opinions about a lot of the issues that I was interested in covering, so I had to toe the line in some way. But because of my Folded Map project, and it got such wonderful reception in the larger Chicago public, people started putting me in contact with this small report that had come out called The Plunder of Black Wealth in Chicago. And it came out in 2019. My Folded Map project came out in 2018. And people were asking, oh, do you know, is your project connected to this report? And it wasn't. But again, relationship building. I reached out to the producers of that report, the funders of that report, the researchers of that report. And as a result of the relationship we built in 2019, that relationship and the information they allowed me to have of that report was the foundation of my current project, as well as Inequity for Sale, about land sale contracts, which I literally created landmarkers for a collection of nearly 600 homes that were stolen from aspiring black homeowners in Greater Englewood through that predatory practice. But this is the clincher. One of the landmarkers that I placed in front of one of the homes connected me to a direct descendant of the couple that I included on the landmarker. So once he started telling me about everything that he was going through in his life as a homeowner, the value of his house not being much, him not being able to get repairs, he introduced me to everybody else on the block who were also older legacy homeowners in Greater Inglewood. Then we came together and created the foundation of my current project. So again, it's always this give and take, but for me, it's rooted in the fact that I grew up and live in the neighborhood that is ultimately became the poster child of everything wrong in Chicago, and I wanted to change that. This way.
This way.
Like a rapper.
The theme I'm hearing up here, running through it is, to build trust, to build sources, you really need to be there. You need to be there, you need to be listening to them, you need to find out what's important to them, because then you're going to start getting people to pay attention to it. But as Jamie said, when you do start writing and reporting and putting it out there, you got to get it right the first time, or as best you can. They'll come and, it sounds like Jamie's sources are pretty kind, well, they'll offer some gentle criticism, but if you get it right, you'd be surprised at how many more people come out of the woodwork to say, okay, these guys know what they're talking about, I trust them, I'm going to give them something even better. And that happens all the time.
And that actually includes cops. So I write a lot very critically about the Chicago Police Department, but there are lots of cops who sort of appreciate it because I get it right. I mean, even crooked cops who want to talk because they know that you know what you know.
And it's hugely important. And combine that with, okay, I'm from the neighborhood, I'm talking to people in the neighborhood, I'm writing about something that's important to them, and all of a sudden you get this whole new batch of people that say, I trust what you're saying, I'm ready to share my secrets with you, or pass along sources like, you really need to talk with that guy. The other thing is, to the point of cultivating those sources, or keeping up with them, you need to let them know when the stories run. Send it to them. Say, how did I do? Check in with them. Do a follow-up story. So often media will do sort of a hit and run and then never come back to it. But if you're onto something, there are follow-up stories to be had, and that's when more and more people start believing, like, okay, I think they're onto something here. I think there's something wrong here that needs to be fixed. And that's when you start seeing impact, when you really just continue to show it and force people to take action.
Yeah, and I would say further that I think this is implicit in what all of us have said, is relative to mainstream and sort of dominant forms of reporting. I think this kind of work is founded on the principle that local knowledge really matters. There are things that people know on the ground, the people most affected by the phenomena, the policies, the practices we write about, that you can't find anywhere else. So it's not just a humane gesture towards community. As journalists, that's where the stories are.
And then also our relationships with each other. Block Club Chicago, with its focus on hyper-local reporting, has been really critical in people becoming aware of my work. I might be a social justice artist, but I'm still an Inglewood resident. And for me, outside of galleries and exhibitions that I have not had the privilege of having access to, my relationship with Block Club Chicago and them being interested in what is going on in my neighborhood has allowed the work that I do to spread, and for residents to reach out to me, wanting to understand how do you get coverage, how do you build a relationship with reporters? And because of our relationship, I've been able to share that knowledge with my neighbors, that it's literally, reporters have an email, they're human. You can email them, you can contact them, but that is the case with all of us up here, especially Block Club Chicago. They report with such thoughtfulness and care, and they really demonstrate to residents that they're interested.
I do have one more question for you all, but Alex, are we going to Q&A, or we have
No, I
time?
think we got time for you to ask a question, and then maybe.
Okay. So I think it was Shamus, you mentioned the word impact here. We've already been talking about it quite a bit, different ways that you know that you're doing your job right. You're building sources, you're gaining trust, you're getting tips, you're building future collaborations for other projects, like you were talking about, Tonika, with the landmarker. Are there other ways that you hold yourselves accountable to your communities to make sure that you are following your North Stars? Whether that's, like Illinois Answers, we have an impact tracker, and we want to make sure that we are actually reaching people and making things happen with our stories. And if you have one, was there ever a particular moment where you really felt that yeah, we're doing it right, we're serving our readers?
I think for Borderless, I would say in late December, we got a tip about the migrant shelter, the inhumane conditions at the largest city-run migrant shelter, and we are a tiny team, and it was all hands on deck. I was on the ground reporting for 2 weeks, just trying to get as many folks to talk to us about the experience, and the story went up on a Thursday, and I had been passing out my number and cards with the QR code to our website so that people can read the stories. We published on a Thursday, and unfortunately, 3 days later, a 5-year-old boy died at the shelter. And I had just got back into town, and my phone was exploding with calls and WhatsApp messages and text messages from migrants who had talked to us, but a lot of people that they had spread my number to. And so it was a little bit overwhelming, but it was, it was nice to know that the story that we initially ran, that they were reading it and they were spreading it throughout themselves as well. And then after that, it was just more and more and more tips about what was going on there. And I think for me, just making sure that they saw the story and that they were reading it and spreading it around themselves, and then trusting us to continue to tell more stories from inside of the shelter. I think that was where I measured the most impact, because it was reaching the community. I mean, we wanted the elected officials to see the story and take some action, but I think more than anything, it was making sure that the community that was being impacted by this was reading it and was spreading it around themselves as well. I think for that kind of, let me know I was at the right place at the right time, the right publication for me at this moment. As someone who grew up in a mixed status family, I know how difficult it is to navigate the immigration system and different agencies and departments, and just making sure that I'm elevating and centering the voices of communities that are impacted by these policies. Having lived it, I think that is important, and to see that happen with this story in particular, and then having more tips coming from that, I think that is most important for me, and I would say probably the Borderless team would agree with me on that one as well.
At Block Club, we measure impact in really minuscule ways. We love the big stuff. We're at awards night, so I don't want to say awards aren't great. And law changes and policy and seeing things actually change in the community. But we also like to document internally. We encourage the reporters to all share even small wins. Just about things that they wrote about that made a difference to a couple people. It could be wrote about a guy whose ice cream cart was stolen, and that he made a living on that. He was 80 years old or something. So we wrote about him in the story, and that there was a GoFundMe up there. And you look up a couple of days later, and there's like $100,000 in the GoFundMe, and we just changed this guy's life because we told a very human story and got it out to a lot of people, and people that cared about whether or not it was him or someone they know that was just like him, that they could make a difference for that. But we love all the GoFundMes that we end up like closing out, but even like the bakeries that we write about, the mom and pop bakeries that when they open, they'll call us and say, we sold out by noon, we had no idea. We had no idea how many people were going to read this story. That's a big win for them. It's a great win for us, and it's something that really helps, internally. To be selfishly, it builds morale within the reporters. Like, wow, I can write something that can really help someone, and that wasn't, and that was a fun story to write too. It wasn't a gloom and doom story today. So, impact could be a lot of different things.
Yeah, one of the most touching impacts that comes to mind is I did a presentation about my folded map project to a group of 15, 16-year-old black students on Chicago's West Side. And I shared with them the short animation that I made about the project because it doesn't exist in an exhibit anymore. So I created a 30-minute animation about the origin story of the project, and it explained the project. And I had went to the restroom after, shortly towards the end of the animation, and then when I came back, they were all writing. And I was like, I asked the teacher, like, oh, so what are they doing now? And she said, oh, they're writing a letter to the alderman. Because in your animation, you explained how the role of an alderman, and it got them upset about some of the things in their neighborhood. And I was like, oh my gosh. So these are impacts that, you don't have a specific measurable, but I have so many moments like that I'm interested in being able to capture and share that, so we can think about how we measure and what we think about impact differently, because people are always asking, okay, as a social justice artist, how have you changed your neighborhood? Well, okay, I can't really give you all of the ways in which it's changed or impacted the entire neighborhood. But what I can tell you is that the map twins from my folded map project, they decided to expand my project on their own and created block twins. They introduced their neighbors to each other. So now you have 2 blocks from racially and economically different neighborhoods that now know each other. I can tell you that the support and reception of my work as an artist allowed me to get the funding to do my current project, which is literally helping legacy homeowners in Greater Inglewood get home repairs. That would not have happened without the support of my previous projects. I would not have been an artist that was eligible to execute this kind of reparative art project. So there's a lot of different ways we can think about impact, but we do have to get a little bit creative with it.
So I don't want to be the downer at the party, but I think there's also reason to be self-interrogating about impact. I think that all of us are trying to keep our ships afloat, and fundraising and making an argument for the impact of our work. And I think there are classic journalistic metrics of impact, laws that are changed, people that are fired, people who are voted out of office. And certainly my colleagues and I at the Invisible Institute have had that kind of impact. But what I grapple with, and I think it's important as part of our practice to sort of stay alive to these questions, is the question of whether the underlying conditions that give rise to the harms that we have reported on have been affected at all by our reporting. The resistance to meaningful change. And so again, coming back, and I think others have said this, and I really, envy the concreteness of a bakery selling out as a result of my reporting. I mean, that would be, I sort of love that. But, with these larger issues that we're raising about fundamental structures of inequality in the society, I just think it's important as journalists not to let our advertisements for ourselves, so to speak, to obscure the resistance we're encountering. And that's not a voice of resignation about this at all. It's just trying to be diagnostically clear and honest with ourselves and with our readers. And so, the ultimate impact is meaningful change in the lives, the lived experience of people most affected by oppressive policies and practices and the way the society is organized. And I guess if there's a North Star, to use your image, that's it. But I would urge a kind of skepticism about impact.
I even say the arguments that happen online as a result of any one of our stories or projects being shared, that's also impact, because people are interrogating each other, and it helps kind of spread that algorithm so people can get introduced to all of this information. So I would even say the arguments online, that's impact as well.
Yeah. And I would add, you're going to hear from Nicole Hannah-Jones in a minute, but I recently heard her observe that a central role, a central nerve in our work is simply bearing witness. And I think holding on to that as a sort of core value, sort of vocational commitment, is clarifying.
And I would also add to that, Jamie, to quote you from last week, you're also trying to infect people with your own questions. Yeah. So I would say if you're able to do that and leave readers with the question that you were trying to ask, whether it was explicit or implicit in a story, could be a form of success as well.
I appreciate that. And I think that goes to what Tonika was saying a moment ago about the arguments, the conversation. I think one metric that really matters is, does the work generate conversations that would not otherwise have taken place?
I love the idea when you said that of infecting someone else with your questions, the idea of spreading curiosity like it's a virus, that's our job. I heard a lot about, I heard this, and Tonika's talking about, the 8th graders or the kids who heard about things and immediately their response was to go talk to their alderman. I feel like this is something that is kind of at the nexus of the service and accountability. The service is that you're training other people to become more accountable, you're spreading the curiosity. There's an Albert Einstein quote that imagination is more important than knowledge, and I would paraphrase that to curiosity is more important than knowledge. I think that's a great way to measure what we're doing. Do you have one?
Yeah, well, I would also say that, if you're looking for what's the opposite of racism, anti-Semitism, Islamophobic, attitudes, I'm not sure the opposite of those things is tolerance, per se. I think it's curiosity. So, a racist knows everything they need to know about another person just on the basis of an incidental fact about them. It's a kind of false knowledge. It's the polar opposite of curiosity. So again, I appreciate your excavating the remark about infecting with questions. I think to the extent that our work does that, it does have a salutary impact.
I think it's also a big part of our Illinois Answers Project brand is, I think, almost 2 years old now. And a big part of that, there's sort of a misconception that it's the idea that we're here to provide answers. But the idea is we're here to demand answers, and we're here to get our readers to demand answers too. So with that, we want all of you to infect us with your questions. If anyone has, we can try to run mics out to you, or Tom over here.
Well, hello, everybody. Good evening. This is an amazing group of people. I have such a civic love for you. But I have a plea, actually, for you and other attendees. I have a project that's had some impact called the TIFF Illumination Project for the last 11 years, but the legacy media hasn't reported on it. After 225 public meetings, 15,000 people, with no budget whatsoever. I'm not long for this world, so I want to hand it off to somebody. Maybe there's somebody in this room who will take it. We've got databases, right? We track all the TIFFs in Chicago every year, and it's a racist scam. And if you're talking about property and infecting people with curiosity, we've turned hundreds of people into TIFF illuminators. They've become investigators of their own community. They need to know where their money's going, because it's not working for them. So, if anyone wants
It's
Let me just assist in making that become more public. You have Block Club Chicago here, and as I said before, their reporters are always interested in covering stories like that. And one thing that I've learned in my unofficial partnership with Block Club Chicago is because the large media outlets are, understaffed, they pay attention to hyper-local media coverage. And they pick up stories of hyper-local media outlets. So, whether it's Tribe, City Bureau, Block Club Chicago, Borderless, I would suggest just connecting with them and seeing what can happen.
Connected. Thank you. No, thank you for the nudge. Absolutely. I remember back in the day, using the word TIFF in a news story was a dirty word. It had to be followed by a tax increment financing district is a specific area of, and blah, 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 and the editor would roll his eyes. But, TIFF is now a part of the daily conversation for everything because of your work and Ben Jarofsky's constant interest in it. So yes, thank you for the nudge. It's something that, as the city continues to experiment with, play games with, do different things with, it's absolutely a part of the Chicago funding formula that deserves a lot of scrutiny.
We have another question over here.
Takes me a while to get up. Hi, Tonika, Ori Pinnick here.
Hi,
Chicago
Ori.
lover and Inglewood. And no, you too did. I'm old, so I know almost everybody. My question has to do with, and you guys are impressive and deserve national, if not international, recognition for what you're doing. Because in a complex country and a very complex city, and both my daughters are journalists, professors, it is not easy to tell the truth. People don't want to hear it. To that point, what do you perceive can be done about structural disinformation that goes to that extra length to make what you say is truth to be seen as false? And that's, when I talk to young people, and I'm a retired civil rights attorney and blah, 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 but what the disinformation, it's not the intentional disinformation that they have. It is hard for me to structurally attack it because it is so well structured. From race, gender, you guys know, I could go on and on. Class isolation is by choice. People choose to live in ghettos. That's the word that they're using. And so help me, and maybe others, understand what do we as not professional journalists, but people who try to communicate and refer them to you, how do we encourage them to seek out truth as opposed to disinformation?
I don't have an answer to that. I think it's the question of our moment, but we all are, in our practice as journalists, situated, placed, rooted, embedded. And that is in some respects an antidote to the kind of hallucinatory swirl of misinformation, conspiracy theory, and all in the ether, that we all unfortunately have to live in relationship to. One of the questions that I have always asked people who come and volunteer with the Invisible Institute, we've had a history of law students at the University of Chicago working with us within the curriculum. And, I've often asked people when they're first being introduced to the Invisible Institute, how do you know what you know about the world? Just that question, how do you know what you know about the world? And, and what my intention is to bring people into a relationship to the kind of work and inquiries we're engaged in, where they realize that it's possible to know things directly through their nerve endings. And that actually we live in a city where all sorts of knowledge is available to us through our senses. We bring our bodies along. There's so much, there's so much to be known. And so I think this sort of crisis of disinformation, or however we want to characterize it, maybe the antidote, again, is at the neighborhood level in, being able to build common understandings of at least this is true. This tree is standing here. This building is decrepit and dangerous. So that's not a sufficient answer, Ori, I know, but I do think that the kind of the work that's being discussed here pushes against the disinformation by kind of grounding people in a knowable world.
Yeah, I would agree with that completely. I think one of the things we try to do at Block Club is to fight false narratives about Chicago itself. There seems like there's more and more of them around the country about Chicago is this, Chicago is that. And we write for Chicago, and it's a very interested audience in getting out the real truth about Chicago's neighborhoods. That's why we put reporters in neighborhoods to tell stories just about the normal things that are going on, the interesting things, the things that the neighbors are talking about, not the things that the media is talking about or like they're using against us, to really paint a picture of what living in a Chicago neighborhood is like. So yes, building off those stories, trying to change perceptions within the community, but also with that, from without, just from the people all over. But I also think it's important to, when you see disinformation, to do your best to debunk it. Write those stories to say this is BS. This is, you're saying this about Chicago. Here's the real truth, and portray it that way as a sort of like a, just trying to set the record straight and debunking some of the false narratives. So we try to do that a lot, but that's, it's an important thing to spread around. Because as Chicagoans, to Jamie's point, Tonika's point, we understand what's really happening. We got to spread that word around as best we can.
And how you spread it is very important. So to disrupt misinformation, you also have to be very explicit and conscious about getting the accurate information out there. And this is where I get frustrated. Sorry, I'm going to criticize the journalism bubble here, but we have to break out of our own silos. And since I am a creative that deeply respects and have existed in the journalism sector, being an intern of Laura Washington, being an intern at the Chicago Reporter, I see an opportunity for there to be a lot of more cross-cultural, cross-sector collaborations, and specifically kind of with what he raised about the stories that he wanted to get out about TIFF. Use your creative industry that's here. Like, there should be more collaborations between journalists and creatives in the cities or within the issues that is being covered, because I was also, I could have been looked over in that sense as, not someone to be respected or paid attention to just because I am a creative. But there are creatives who really want to amplify and popularize a lot of the information, accurate information that's being covered, issues that are important to them. But there really needs to be more partnership, collaboration with individuals outside of the journalism sector. And I would dare to say the creative industry in Chicago, it should be some partnerships.
Thank you all so much. We do have one last question, but we're running out of time here. So I wonder if we could do a lightning round, like lightning responses.
Yeah, so Tonika, a few years ago, there was some controversy talking about online, about how the New York Times did a story that was very similar to your Folded Mat project. There was a lot of discussion around that. And I'm a City Bureau fellow and I've been with Southside Weekly forever. I did want to ask, because I just got an email about our housing issue. What is your project doing right, and why was like the New York Times project wrong, like comparing and contrasting those two?
Well, first of all, my project is trademarked, so there's that. In addition to that, it raised up a larger issue that I think is really important in the journalism industry, is how journalists and really dedicated reporters get it taken advantage of. Stories that they submit wanting to be, included or covered or hired by these larger media outlets, they get stolen all the time. And that issue that happened with my project, I had a lot of reporters, contacting me saying, oh, I appreciate you trying to battle this. I appreciate what you're doing, and you should do this because they did this to me. So there is, a very insidious part to how a lot of dedicated reporters get taken advantage of by these larger media outlets that don't want to pay, and that they can just take the story because, oh, who's to say that you submitted it, or So I would say that was my goal, was to really kind of uncover that specific way in which not only creatives but reporters get taken advantage of, and then also regions. Like, I'm a Chicago artist. Like, how dare you think that you could just do that because you're the New York Times with no pushback? So, yeah, I don't know if I answered the question, but.
I want to thank you all so much for this really enlightening, engaging conversation. Shamus, Toomey, Mauricio, Peña, Jamie, Kalven, Tonika Johnson, please join me in welcoming, in thanking all of them. And with that, we're going to ask everyone to make our way down to the second floor, to the auditorium for the Driehaus Foundation Awards. They're going to start precisely at 5:45, and ask everyone be in their seats by then. Thanks, everyone.